She had nowhere left to go. No money, no family, no place willing to take her in. Caleb Whitlock wasn't looking for a wife. He only needed someone who could cook breakfast for 12 hungry ranch hands. Hiring a desperate widow seemed like the simplest decision he'd make that year. By the first snow, it had become the hardest. Because keeping her meant risking the ranch his father had spent a lifetime building, and for the first time in years, Caleb knew exactly which one he would choose. 3 years a widow now. Sergeant Josiah Freeman had died of a fever at Fort Keogh, and the Army had been kind enough in its way, a folded flag, a letter of condolence, 6 months' pension, that had run out somewhere around Bismarck. She'd sold what she could. She'd kept only what mattered: his trunk, his good boots that fit no one now, and a reference letter from the post-surgeon's wife that no one in this town seemed inclined to read past the first line. Dell had asked at the mercantile, the boarding house, even the rail office. Each time the answer came the same practiced way, polite final, already looking past her toward the next customer. She was hungry. She had been hungry for 2 days in a way that made a person quiet and careful with her movements, and she told herself this was simply what Tuesday felt like now. The wind came off the Yellowstone with nothing to stop it, and it found every gap in Delilah Freeman's coat like it had been looking for her specifically. She sat on the single bench outside the Miles City Depot, her husband's old Army trunk beside her, and watched the last passenger car pull away west without her in it. She had ridden as far as her money would carry her. That had been the plan, such as it was. Beyond Miles City there was no plan at all. A wagon rolled up along the depot road, driven by a man who did not look like he had time to spare for a stranger's troubles. He drew the team to a stop without being asked, and Dell kept her eyes on her hands, on the trunk, on anything that was not his face. Pride was a foolish thing to carry when a person had nothing else but it was hers, and she held on to it. He climbed down. He was tall in the way that took up space without trying to weathered through the shoulders and the forearms, his hat pulled low against the wind. He did not speak right away. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence line that's come down somewhere he can't yet see, assessing, not unkind, working out what needed doing before he said a word about it. "You waiting on someone?" he said finally. Not quite a question. "No," Dell said. The ride out took the better part of an hour through country that opened wider the farther they went, from town dry grass silvered by the wind, fence posts marching off toward a horizon that didn't end so much as blur into sky. Dell watched it pass and said little. He asked nothing about where she'd come from or what had brought her to a depot bench with an Army trunk and no ticket forward, and she was grateful down to her bones for that silence. Her story was heavy. She was tired of the weight of telling it. He nodded slowly, as if that answer told him something he'd already guessed. His gaze moved to the trunk, to her hands folded too carefully, in her lap, back to her face. She lifted her chin a fraction. She would not be pitied. She had survived worse than a cold bench. "Can you cook?" he said. "For 15 men most days, sometimes more at gathering time." Inside told the rest of the story before Caleb said a word of it. Dust sat thick along the mantel. A stack of unopened correspondence leaned against a lamp on the table like it had given up trying to be dealt with. The kitchen was worse, a skillet crusted with some meal long past remembering, a nearly empty flour bin, a smell of old coffee gone bitter in the pot. A man living here. Not a home. A place to sleep between one day's work and the next. Dell's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. She had braced herself for a dozen things, a warning to move along, a suspicious question about her business in town, the particular kind of charity that cost a person their dignity to accept. She had not braced for this. "I cooked for a company of soldiers for 6 years, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. 15 men is a light morning. Something in his face did not exactly soften, but it settled like a month setting down a weight he'd been carrying without noticing. "Caleb Whitlock," he said. "Whitlock Ridge, north of town." "Delilah Freeman." He didn't offer his hand, and she didn't expect him to. He simply turned back toward the wagon, lifted her trunk himself before she could reach for it, and set it in the bed like it weighed nothing at all. "Well, pump's out back," Caleb said, watching her take it in, waiting for whatever reaction she'd give him. Disgust, maybe, or the kind of pity he plainly had no use for. "Rags," Dell said instead. "And soap if you've got more than that sliver by the sink. I'll need a bucket, too." He sat and ate without speaking, and when he finished, he carried his own plate to the basin and washed it himself, which she noted and said nothing about. A man who didn't expect to be waited on. A man building towards something he didn't yet have a name for, one small, unspoken gesture at a time. "Hands come in for the fall gather in a week," he said, finally setting the clean plate in the rack. 12 of them counting Sam. Whitlock Ridge announced itself first as a line of fence, then a barn, then a house long and low-built for weather rather than looks, the kind of place a man had put up to last rather than to impress anyone. Smoke rose thin from a single chimney. No curtains stirred in the windows. By the time the light went long and gold through the west window, Dell had scrubbed the stove to bare iron and swept a floor that hadn't seen a broom in longer than she cared to guess. She found half a sack of beans, a heel of salt pork, a sprouting onion, and made a soup that was nothing fancy and everything she needed. She ate sitting at a table she'd cleaned with her own hands, and it tasted, she thought, like the first solid ground she'd stood on in a year. He didn't ask why, and he didn't apologize for the state of things. He simply went to fetch what she'd asked for, and something in the plainness of it, no explanation demanded, no shame performed, told Dell more about Caleb Whitlock than an hour of conversation might have. It wasn't a question, and Dell understood it for what it was, not an order, not quite a welcome either. Something closer to an agreement being struck, without either of them saying so aloud. "I'll need to go into town for supplies," she said. "I'll have Sam take you at first light." The cast-iron stove had a crack along its left side that Dell discovered on her second morning, when a thin curl of smoke found its way out, where it had no business escaping. She packed the seam with wet ash and let it dry hard by the fire, the way her mother had taught her years before. Either of them had a stove worth saving. It would hold. Most things could be made to hold if a person paid attention to where they were breaking. When Caleb came in from the evening chores, he stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was transformed, not fine, but clean, lit, warm-smelling of onion and pork instead of dust. A plate waited on the stove's warming shelf, covered with a cloth. He nodded once, took his hat from the peg, and stepped back out into the last of the evening light, leaving Dell alone in a kitchen that had in the space of one afternoon stopped being merely his and started becoming in some small and fragile way also hers. She stood a long moment in the quiet after he'd gone, listening to the house settle around her, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine what it might feel like to stay somewhere. "You've done this before," he said the third day, when he found she'd gotten the crooked oven door to seal properly with nothing but a folded strip of tin. "6 years feeding soldiers," Dell said, not looking up from the dough she was working. "A cracked stove is a Tuesday." He almost smiled. She caught it at the edge of her vision, not quite arriving, but close enough that she understood it was there waiting on something. She said nothing of it. It was not her business, not yet. And a woman 2 days into a position did not go rearranging what she did not yet understand. What she did understand was flour and fire and how far a dollar could be made to stretch, and so she spent her mornings turning a kitchen that had given up into one that worked. She'd been 3 days at Whitlock Ridge, and in that time she had learned the shape of the place the way she once learned the shape of an army post, by its weaknesses first. The flour bin needed refilling before the week's end. The root cellar, when she found it, half collapsed behind the house, held potatoes gone soft at one end, but sound enough at the other. And in the account book left open on the corner desk, not snooped at, only glimpsed while dusting, she'd seen enough of Caleb Whitlock's ledger to understand that Whitlock Ridge was not a wealthy operation pretending otherwise. It was a place running close to its margins, the way most honest ranches did. She said nothing of that to Caleb either. It was not yet a fire worth naming. Back at the ranch, she filled the flour bin, restocked the coffee, and found in a forgotten crate on the porch a sack of dried apples that must have sat there since the previous fall. That evening she made a cobbler from them, simple and warm, and set it on the table without comment. Caleb watched her do it, though he tried not to make a show of watching. He'd come in at midday for a cup of coffee and find himself lingering a beat longer than the coffee required, leaning in the doorway, while Dell moved between stove and table with an economy of motion that spoke of years doing exactly this at scale for people who depended on her getting it right. The town of Miles City did not extend Dell the same patience. She rode in with Sam Ochoa on the fourth day for supplies and felt the weight of glances from the mercantile's other customers, not hostile, not yet, but assessing in a way that made her stand a little straighter and speak a little more plainly than she might have otherwise. A woman new in a bachelor's house was a fact that traveled fast in a town this size, and Dell had lived enough of her life under other people's judgment to know when it had started circling. Not all men know it about themselves. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, not quite meeting her eye now. "I didn't till lately." It was as close to a compliment as she'd had in longer than she cared to count, and she didn't know what to do with the warmth it stirred. So she busied herself clearing the plates and let the moment settle unspoken between them, the way most things at Whitlock Ridge seemed to settle, without ceremony, but not without weight. Caleb came in late from mending fence, tired in the particular way of a man who has spent the day fighting wire and posts and losing more than he won. He stopped at the sight of the cobbler, the way he'd stopped at the sight of the clean kitchen days before, a small pause, a recalibration, as though the house kept surprising him with evidence that it was becoming something other than what he'd left it as that morning. He ate 2 helpings. He did not say much about it beyond a quiet "good," but he said it looking directly at her, and something in the directness of his blue eyes made Dell look down at her own hands a moment longer than the task required. "Sam tells me the hands respect a full table," Caleb said, eventually breaking the quiet. "More than they respect most things." "Men usually do," Dell said. She did not try to win them over with words. She fed them. The first supper was beef stew thick with potatoes and the last good carrots from the root cellar, 2 pans of biscuits risen high and split open, steaming, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The long table, usually loud with the rough back and forth of tired men, letting off the day's frustration, went quiet in a different way, quiet, with the sound of forks working and plates being scraped clean. That night, after Caleb had gone to check the horses one last time, Dell sat alone at the scrubbed table and allowed herself briefly to notice how much less the kitchen felt like a stranger's house than it had 4 days before. She was careful with the feeling. She had learned at cost not to trust a warm room too quickly, but she let herself have it a moment longer than was strictly wise because it had been a long while since anything had felt worth the risk. The fall gather arrived the way Sam Ochoa had promised, 12 men riding in dust-caked and short-tempered 3 weeks of pushing cattle out of high country, written plain across their faces. They eyed the ranch house kitchen with the particular skepticism of men used to their own scorched coffee and half-raw bacon, and they eyed Dell with something else entirely, an uncertainty about what a woman's presence at Whitlock Ridge meant for the routines they'd grown comfortable in. Caleb watched it happen from the doorway, arriving late from settling the horses, and something in his chest loosened at the sight of his dining table full and satisfied in a way it hadn't been in years. He did not join them at first. He simply stood, taking in the warmth of it, the lamplight, the steam still rising off the stew pot, Dell moving between the men with the easy competence of someone entirely in her element. Sam was the first to say anything. He set his fork down, looked at Dell across the room, and gave her a single nod, deep and without irony. "Ma'am," he said, "that's the best supper's come out of this kitchen since Whitlock's mother passed." A few of the other hands murmured agreement, gruff and awkward the way men were when admitting something tender. Dell allowed herself a small answering nod, and nothing more. She understood that respect earned this way through work, rather than words, was worth more than any compliment paid in the moment. "Sam's not an easy man to impress," Caleb said, eventually setting a dried plate in the rack. "Rode with him 3 years. Never seen him give a compliment that fast." "Man's just hungry," Dell said, though she felt the warmth of the observation more than she let show. "Might be." Caleb looked at her, then direct in that way he had blue eyes steady beneath the lamplight. "Might be it's more than that." He found himself thinking, not for the first time that week, that the house had begun to breathe again after a long, held breath. Later, after the hands had gone out to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen had emptied of everything but the last of the dishes, Caleb lingered. He picked up a towel without being asked, and began drying what Dell washed, an offer of help she hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to refuse. "You didn't have to do that," she said, nodding at the towel. "Didn't have to," he agreed, "but a kitchen goes faster with two." They worked in a silence that had by now stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like something closer to comfort, the kind two people share when neither needs to fill every quiet moment with talk. Dell found herself aware in a way she hadn't quite let herself be before, of how close he stood at the basin of the steady rhythm of his hands working the towel over each plate, careful and unhurried. A rider passed through the yard the next morning on his way north, a narrow city-suited man Dell had never seen before, cutting across Whitlock land like he had every right to it. He drew his horse up short at the sight of her hanging wash near the porch, studied her a long moment, with the particular thoroughness of a man taking inventory, and did not dismount. "You'd be the new cook," he said. Not a question. "I would," Dell said, matching his flat tone with one of her own. He didn't explain what he meant, and Dell didn't ask him to, but she felt the words settle somewhere she hadn't expected to still have room for feeling. And when he said goodnight and stepped out toward the bunkhouse to check on the men, she stood a moment at the window watching his shape cross the yard and let herself wonder just briefly what he'd meant by it. The kitchen, when she finally banked the fire and went to her own small room off the back hall, felt less like a stranger's house than it had that morning. It felt for the first time since she'd stepped off the train with nothing but a trunk and a fading letter of reference, something close to hers. The apple trees behind the horse barn had gone wild years back, untended, since before Caleb's father died, but they still bore fruit, small tart things that no one had thought to gather in longer than anyone could say. Dell found them by accident following the sound of windfall thudding into the grass on an afternoon errand to check the smokehouse, and stood a long moment just looking at them, struck by the waste of it. He said nothing further, only touched the brim of his hat, the gesture somehow more assessment than courtesy, and rode on toward town without offering his name. Dell stood a moment watching him go, an uneasy feeling settling low in her stomach that she couldn't yet put a name to. She mentioned it to Caleb that evening. His jaw tightened at the description alone. "Thaddeus," he said. "My uncle. He doesn't ride out this way for nothing." He said no more than that, but Dell understood, watching him go quiet over his supper, that whatever had just passed through the yard was not finished passing through it. She said nothing about it to him either. But that evening after supper was cleared and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, she stayed up past when she needed to, working the apples into a deep dish pie, its crust rolled thin and flaky, its filling spiced with cinnamon she'd found forgotten at the back of a cupboard. She said nothing about it to Caleb. It didn't seem her place to point out what a man had let go untended on his own land. But the next morning, a basket sat outside the kitchen door, apples a dozen or more still cool with dew, arranged with more care than the task strictly required. No note, no explanation. Dell carried the basket inside and set it on the table, and stood there a moment, turning an apple over in her hand, understanding exactly what it was and exactly what it wasn't. Not charity, not obligation, just a man noticing a need before it was spoken and doing something about it quietly, the way she was coming to understand, was the only way Caleb Whitlock knew how to say anything that mattered. "Haven't had pie like that," he said, when he opened his eyes again, "since my mother kept this kitchen." "When was that?" "Long while now." He looked at the slice a moment, then at her. "Feels less long somehow this week." Caleb came in from his last round of the evening to find it cooling on the windowsill, and stopped in the doorway the way he'd taken to stopping lately, as if the house kept handing him small surprises he didn't know what to do with, except stand still and receive. "You didn't have to do that," he said, echoing without meaning to the same words she'd said to him days before over a dish towel. "Didn't have to," Dell agreed. "But apples go faster into a pie than into nothing at all." He almost smiled at that, the same almost smile she'd caught the edge of before, closer now to arriving fully. He cut himself a slice and ate it standing at the counter, and when he closed his eyes at the first bite just briefly, Dell understood she was watching a man taste something that reached further back than the pie itself. Some memory of a kitchen that had once been warm before it had gone cold and silent, for reasons he'd never once explained to her. Thaddeus Whitlock was narrow, where his nephew was broad, precise where Caleb was plain, dressed in a city suit that had never once known a day of ranch work. He climbed down with a lawyer trailing a step behind him, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, and surveyed the ranch yard with the particular disdain of a man who had always believed his brother's choice of life to be a foolish one. Dell felt the words land somewhere she wasn't fully prepared for, and busied her hands with the washing up rather than answer them directly. It was easier she was learning to speak through the work than through words that might ask more of her than she was ready to give. But that night, lying in her narrow bed off the back hall, she found herself turning the moment over the way she'd turn a coin, checking it from every side. She had told herself arriving at Whitlock Ridge that this was a position, and nothing more, a wage, a roof, a kitchen to run. She had not planned for a man who noticed wild apples and said nothing about it, who dried dishes without being asked, who looked at her the way Caleb Whitlock had started looking at her, like a question he was in no hurry to rush toward an answer. She was not ready to name what was growing between them. But she recognized, lying awake with the taste of cinnamon still faint on her tongue, that it was growing all the same, not through any single dramatic moment, but the way most true things grew slowly through the accumulated weight of small and unremarkable kindnesses, each one adding to the last, until one day a person looked up and found the ground beneath them had shifted without her quite noticing when. "Uncle Thaddeus," Caleb said, coming around from the barn, his voice even, but his shoulders set in a way Dell had not seen before. "Caleb." Thaddeus's eyes moved past his nephew, found Dell on the porch, and lingered there a beat too long, assessing the way a banker assesses a debt he suspects is about to come due. "And who is this?" "Mrs. Freeman keeps my kitchen," Caleb said. Plain. No more explanation offered than that. The buggy that pulled up in front of Whitlock Ridge 2 weeks later was too polished for the dust it rolled through black lacquer, catching sunlight in a way nothing at the ranch was built to catch it. Dell was beating rugs on the porch line when she saw it come up the road, and something in her chest went tight before she even saw the man step down. She had grown up around men who arrived in buggies like that. They rarely came bearing anything a person wanted to hear. Does she? Thaddeus's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Keeps it well, I hope. For your sake. Something in the phrasing made Dell's spine straighten, though she said nothing, only nodded once in greeting, and returned her attention to the rug she was beating, giving the men what privacy they seemed to want, for whatever business had brought a lawyer's portfolio all the way from Helena. My father's will, he said finally, when Dell set a plate in front of him he hadn't asked for and wasn't yet eating. Leaves the ranch to me, but my uncle holds it in trust, judges whether I'm fit to keep it. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something like fear behind the steadiness of his blue eyes. He's never thought I was. That evening, once Thaddeus and his lawyer had taken rooms in town rather than the ranch, Caleb sat a long while at the kitchen table without eating, staring at nothing in particular. But she heard enough drifting through the open window as she moved through her afternoon chores to understand the shape of what was coming. Words like provision and conduct, and at the executor's discretion, legal language wrapped around what she recognized, even without knowing every particular, as a threat dressed up as a formality. Caleb looked up sharply at that something fierce and immediate in his face that surprised her. Don't, he said. Don't apologize for existing in my kitchen, Delilah. Whatever trouble's coming, it was mine before you ever stepped off that train. Dell pulled out the chair across from him. A small thing sitting rather than standing to serve, but it changed the shape of the conversation, made it something shared rather than something delivered. What's changed that he'd come all this way to say it now? Caleb didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than she'd heard it. Might be nothing to do with the ranch at all. Might be he heard something in town he didn't care for. He didn't say what, and Dell didn't ask him to spell it out. She understood, with a cold certainty settling low in her stomach, exactly what a man like Thaddeus Whitlock would have heard whispered about a widow living under his nephew's roof, and exactly how little truth would matter once such whispers started circling. I'm sorry, she said quietly, if my being here has made trouble for you. Miles City's church was small, whitewashed, and full on Sunday mornings, in a way that made every latecomer's entrance a small public event. Dell stepped through the door beside Caleb and felt the room's attention shift toward her, the way a field of grass bends all at once beneath a single gust of wind, subtle but unmistakable, and gone again, before anyone could be accused of staring outright. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the first time he'd stood so plainly between her and the shame the world seemed determined to hand her. Dell said nothing, but something in her chest, some old guarded thing she'd kept locked since Josiah died, shifted a fraction, just enough to let a little more light through than she'd allowed in a long while. She did not yet know how much it would cost either of them to keep that light burning. But she understood, watching Caleb push his uneaten plate aside and rest his head briefly in his hands, that whatever was coming, they would face it from the same side of the table now, and not from opposite ones. Caleb noticed. He noticed the whole ride home, in fact, Dell quieter than her usual quiet, her gaze fixed somewhere past the horizon, rather than on the road ahead, her hands folded a shade too tightly in her lap. You've gone somewhere else, he said, finally breaking the silence between them as the wagon rolled north out of town. I'm here, Dell said. You're sitting beside me, Caleb said. That's not the same thing as here. She had dressed carefully that morning, more carefully than the occasion strictly demanded her one good dress, pressed her hair pinned just so, the small deliberate armor a woman puts on when she suspects a room may already have decided something about her before she walks through the door. Reverend Amos Kirby preached a sermon on charity that morning, and Dell sat through it with her hands folded, aware the whole while of the particular quality of the silence around her, not hostile exactly, but watchful, the silence of a congregation deciding what to think before it decided what to say. She noticed Mrs. Aldridge, wife of the mercantile owner, glance her way twice during the second hymn and look quickly back to her book both times. She looked at him, then surprised by the plainness of the observation, by how closely he'd been paying attention to something she'd thought she was hiding well enough. "It's nothing," she said. "Just talk. Talk doesn't feed anyone or clothe anyone. It shouldn't matter." But it does. She heard it clearly enough leaving the churchyard, after two women near the hitching post, their voices pitched to carry just far enough. A widow living out at Whitlock Ridge and no chaperone in the house. One of them added something about how a man alone 3 years might welcome any company at all, regardless of what was proper, and the words weren't unkind precisely. They didn't need to be. They carried their judgment plainly enough on their own. Dell kept her face steady and her steps even, the way she'd learned long ago to walk through a room full of opinions about her without letting a single one show on her skin. But something old and tender cracked open beneath the steadiness, the same wound she'd carried since long before Josiah died. Since long before that, even the fear of being seen as a burden, a scandal, a problem, requiring someone else's patience to endure. She had heard versions of this whisper before in other towns, after other losses, and she had thought herself hardened past the reach of it. She found now that she was not. "It does," she admitted quieter than she meant to. "I've had towns talk about me before, Caleb. When Josiah first took sick before he died, there were women at the post who said I ought to have known better than to marry a soldier if I couldn't bear to watch him buried young. I told myself I was past minding what strangers said about a life they knew nothing of. Seems I was wrong about that too." "I know exactly what you're worth," Caleb said. "I've watched you turn a dead kitchen into the only warm room I've had in 3 years. I've watched 12 hard men go quiet with respect at your table. I've watched you scrub a stove and mend a roof and keep a ledger straighter than any bookkeeper my uncle's ever hired. I don't need my uncle or the church ladies of Miles City to tell me what I already know plain as day." Dell felt something in her throat tighten, unexpected and unwelcome in its intensity. She had braced herself over the drive home for him to say something gentler and less certain. A hedge, an apology dressed as reassurance. Some suggestion that perhaps she ought to take a room in town until the talk settled. She had not braced for something so plainly, unflinchingly stated. "You don't know that I'm worth the trouble," she said quietly, testing it, half hoping he'd have no answer. Caleb was silent a long moment, guiding the team around a rut in the road, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual careful neutrality. "I know what they're saying. About you being under my roof. About what that means to people with nothing better to occupy their Sundays." He glanced at her, something raw in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. "I won't pretend it doesn't put us in a hard spot with my uncle circling the way he is. He'd only need half an excuse dressed up as respectability to make his case to the trust. But I need you to hear this plain, Delilah. I don't regret one day you've been in that kitchen. Not one." The ice came near the end of it, glazing the ladder rungs thin and treacherous, and Dell's boot slipped on the way down. Caleb's hand caught her arm before she'd even fully registered the fall, steadying her against him, and for one long moment neither of them moved. The storm roaring around them, her hand gripping his forearm, his other hand at her waist where it had landed to keep her upright. His face was close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against the cold, and for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch far longer than the storm allowed. For neither of them moved to close the last of that distance, though both, she would think later, had wanted to. Dell looked away out at the passing grass gone gold with the last of the season, and let herself, just for the length of the ride home, believe him. The storm came in fast, the way Montana storms did in late October, a sky gone the color of a day-old bruise, wind picking up sharp enough to carry the first sting of sleet before anyone had thought to look for it. Caleb was out checking the horse barn's roofline when the first gust tore a section of shingle loose, and he was still up there wrestling a length of canvas over the gap when Dell came running out with a lantern against the falling dark. "You'll need another set of hands," she called up, already climbing the ladder before he could tell her not to. "Get back inside, Delilah. It's not safe up here in this wind. Neither is losing the roof over 6 horses," she called back, already 2 rungs up. "Hold the canvas steady and let me pass you the nails." He didn't argue further. There wasn't time, and besides, some part of him had stopped being surprised weeks back now by what Dell Freeman was and wasn't capable of. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying, and everything that might have been said felt too large for the wind to carry properly. But Dell felt in that pause something settle between them that had been building slow and unspoken since the first night he'd asked if she could cook for 2. Not the crisis of the moment, but something steadier beneath it, something that had been true for a while now, and was only just being acknowledged in the silence of a held breath. They worked together in the whipping wind, hauling canvas taut and driving nails through numb fingers, the storm loud enough that words weren't much use between them anyway. It was work that asked for trust rather than talk. Dell passing nails before he asked for them, anticipating the next motion, the way 2 people do when they've spent enough weeks learning each other's rhythms without meaning to. Once, when a gust nearly tore the canvas from his grip entirely, she threw her own weight against it, without a word, and between them they held the gap closed until Caleb could drive the last nail home. They got down the ladder without further trouble. They finished securing the barn without further trouble, checking each stall after to be sure the horses had settled, Caleb running a steady hand along the neck of a gelding still spooked by the noise. But when they came back inside, soaked through and half frozen, Dell didn't go straight to her room the way the hour would have called for. She built up the fire instead and made coffee and set a dry blanket over Caleb's shoulders without asking whether he wanted it, and the 2 of them sat at the kitchen table longer than practicality required, steam rising off their cups, saying very little because very little needed saying. She didn't reach for his hand that night, and he didn't reach for hers. But when she finally rose to bank the fire and go to bed, he caught her eye across the low light of the kitchen, and something passed between them that neither one of them needed words to carry, an understanding, quiet and certain that whatever came next for Whitlock Ridge, they would not be facing it as employer and cook any longer, whatever the town or the law or Thaddeus Whitlock chose to call it instead. The words hung in the warm kitchen air a long moment, plain and unadorned, the way everything he said tended to be, and Dell found she had no ready answer for them, only a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire, and everything to do with a man who said true things without dressing them up in anything finer than they needed. "You didn't have to climb up there," Caleb said eventually, his voice rough with cold and exhaustion both. "You didn't have to catch me," Dell said. "Wasn't a choice," Caleb said. "Never really is with you. 2 weeks. Resolved." The words sat ugly on the page, however carefully chosen, and Caleb understood exactly what resolution Thaddeus intended. Dell gone sent back to whatever nothing she'd have without this position, so that his uncle's ledger of respectability could be balanced, and the ranch handed over to men from the railroad who would pay Thaddeus a commission for the privilege. He read the second page twice, then a third time, and felt something in him go cold and clear, in a way fear alone had never managed. This had never been only about appearances. It had been about land and money from the start, and Dell's presence in his kitchen was simply the excuse Thaddeus had been waiting for. The letter arrived by Ryder on a Thursday, sealed in red wax with the mark of a Helena law office, and Caleb read it alone at the kitchen table after Dell had gone to bed, The lamp burned low and his hands not quite steady on the page. Given the continued and unaddressed circumstance of scandal attaching to the household at Whitlock Ridge, it read in the careful language lawyers use to dress cruelty up as procedure. The trust's executor requires that said circumstance be resolved within a period of 2 weeks, or the executor shall be compelled to determine that the beneficiary's conduct falls short of the standard required to maintain his interest in the estate. A second page added almost as an afterthought, noted that a representative of the Northern Pacific's land office had already made informal inquiry regarding acreage in the district should the trust find itself in a position to entertain an offer. She did not cry. She had done all her crying she'd thought years back over losses that had taught her not to expect the world's mercy. But something in her went very quiet and very still, the way it had gone quiet and still on a depot bench in Miles City, with nothing left but a trunk and a fading letter of reference. He did not tell Dell that night. He told himself it was because the hour was too late, that there was no sense waking her with trouble that could keep till morning. But some smaller, more honest part of him knew the real reason he was afraid, in a way he hadn't let himself be afraid of much in years, that the moment she understood the shape of the choice in front of him, she would make it for him before he had the chance to make it himself. She found the letter 3 days later, folded beneath a stack of correspondence she was tidying on the corner desk, and she read it standing at the window, with the morning light falling flat and gray across the page. She read the mention of the railroad's land office twice, understanding at once what it meant, that this had never been a matter her leaving could truly settle, only delay. "Put it down," Caleb said, and something in his voice, low, immediate, almost commanding, in a way she hadn't heard from him before, made her look up despite herself. "Put the trunk down, Delilah." "Caleb." That evening, when Caleb came in from the fields, he found her folding her few belongings into the old army trunk, careful and methodical, the way a person packs when they've decided a thing is already settled, and there's no use dragging it out. "What are you doing?" he said, though the words in her hands answered the question plainly enough. "Saving you the trouble of asking me to go," Dell said, not looking up. "I saw the letter, Caleb. I know what your uncle wants, and I've seen the part about the railroad besides. This was never only about me being in your kitchen. He means to have this land one way or another, and I won't be the excuse he uses to get it. I'll make this simple, Caleb," Thaddeus said, folding his hands atop his portfolio without opening it. "Dismiss Mrs. Freeman from this household today, and I'll consider the matter of your conduct settled. Refuse, and I'll have no choice but to report to the court that you're unfit to hold the estate. The choice is entirely yours. I said put it down." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, close enough now that she could see the whole of what was in his face, not anger, though there was some of that too, but something closer to desperation, a man watching the ground shift beneath him and refusing to let it. "You don't get to decide this for me. Not this. I've let my uncle make every hard decision of my life since my father died, and I will be damned if I let him make this one too, through you, without me ever getting a say. If it's the land he wants sending you away, buys us nothing but time before he finds his next excuse." Dell's hands stilled on the trunk lid, her heart going hard and fast, in a way that had nothing to do with fear now. "Then what do you want to do?" she said quietly. "Because in 2 weeks, he means to take everything, Caleb. The ranch. The land your father worked his whole life for." Caleb was silent a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone steady in a way she recognized the voice of a man who had at last stopped drifting and started deciding. "Then we'll have to show him," he said, "that he's wrong about what matters to a place like this, and that there's nothing here he can buy out from under us with a rumor. And I don't intend to do it alone." The room went still. Dell felt her own heart go quiet and hard in her chest, and she opened her mouth to speak, to offer again to go, but Caleb's hand found hers where it rested on the back of his chair, and held it there, plain and unhurried, in front of his uncle, his lawyer, and his minister both. "Then take the ranch," Caleb said. The meeting took place at the long dining table where 12 hungry men had once eaten, in grateful silence, though, on this occasion, the table held a different kind of company. Thaddeus Whitlock at its head, with his lawyer beside him. Reverend Kirby present at Thaddeus's own insistence as a witness of good standing, and Caleb seated across from them with Dell standing just behind his chair. Thaddeus blinked clearly, having expected a different answer, or at least a longer pause before whichever answer came. "You'd forfeit your father's land," he said slowly over a cook. "I'd forfeit it," Caleb said, "before I forfeit her. You can write that down for the court, if you like the wording." Thaddeus's mouth thinned. "Numbers on a page don't answer the question of appearances, Mrs. Freeman. The scandal, maybe so," Caleb said. "But it's my choice to make, not yours, and I've made it." Dell set a hand on his shoulder, steadying herself as much as him. "Before this goes any further," she said quietly, "there's something you should see, Mr. Whitlock. Not to change what Caleb's already decided that decision's made, and I won't have him unmake it on my account. But you ought to know exactly what you'd be walking away from if you press this." Dell's breath caught. She had braced herself for many things at this table, but not for the sound of a man giving up everything he owned plainly, and without a tremor in his voice for her sake alone. Thaddeus's composure slipped a fraction. This had not been the outcome he'd planned for. He glanced at his lawyer, then back at his nephew, some new calculation working behind his eyes. "You're a fool then," he said. "The estate is worth considerably more than your pride." She stepped forward and opened her ledger, the same careful record-keeping she'd learned feeding an army company applied these past weeks to every sack of flour, every side of beef, every dollar that moved through Whitlock Ridge's kitchen and out to its hands. "There is no scandal," Reverend Kirby said quietly, surprising the table into silence. He had been still through the whole exchange, his hands folded before him, and now he looked at Thaddeus with the mild but unmistakable authority of a man used to settling disputes among his own flock. "I've had women of this congregation come to me with concerns, and I've looked into the matter as is my duty. I find a widow keeping honest, well-run employment in a household that treats her with proper respect. I find no impropriety here, Mr. Whitlock, only unkind talk, which is a different thing entirely, and a lesser sin than the one you seem intent on committing against your own nephew. Since the 1st of September, she said, her voice even and clear, cutting through the room's tension, I've reduced the ranch's food costs by better than a third, through better ordering, through using what the land already provides, instead of buying in town what we could grow or gather ourselves. I've kept a full crew fed, and working through the fall, gather at less expense than the previous year's records show for half the hands." She turned the ledger to face Thaddeus directly. "This isn't sentiment, Mr. Whitlock. This is arithmetic. And it says plainly that Whitlock Ridge runs sounder with me in that kitchen than it did without me. Your nephew was ready to lose all of this over a principle. I'd rather you didn't make him." Thaddeus's face colored, caught between a nephew who'd just offered up his whole inheritance without blinking, and a woman who'd met him with cold arithmetic instead of tears. "This is hardly the forum." "It's exactly the forum," Caleb said, rising from his chair, and stood beside Dell rather than in front of her. "You asked me to choose uncle. I chose. Whatever you decide to do with that is yours to carry, not mine." "I'll want to review these figures at length," Thaddeus said, finally closing his portfolio with considerably less confidence than he'd opened it. "But I'll not pretend the numbers aren't compelling as they stand. Nor," he added with something almost like reluctant respect, "will I pretend I expected that answer from you, Caleb." He rose, gathering his papers. "You'll hear from my office." He left without another word to Dell, but he left, and that alone told her everything she needed to know about which way the ground had shifted. When the door closed behind him, Caleb turned to her, something in his face closer to open than she had ever seen it. "You didn't have to bring out the ledger," he said. "I meant what I told him." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Dell could hear the clock on the mantel marking each second. Thaddeus looked from the ledger to Caleb's unmoved face to the Reverend's steady, unyielding gaze, and Dell watched something calculating pass behind his eyes. A man who had come prepared to win an argument about morality, and found himself instead facing a nephew who'd already conceded the argument, and a set of figures that made the loss considerably more expensive than he'd accounted for. Thaddeus's letter had come that morning, brief and grudging. The matter would not proceed further. The trust's concerns, considered addressed the estate's standing, left undisturbed. Caleb had read it once at the table, folded it without ceremony, and come looking for her. "It's over," he said now, standing beside her in the falling snow. "Whatever else comes, it won't be my uncle standing between us and this place." "Good," Dell said softly, and meant it more than the single word could carry. "I know you did." Dell said, her voice unsteady for the first time in longer than she could remember. "That's exactly why I couldn't let you lose it. Not when I had the means to stop it sitting right there in a book." "We did that then," Caleb said. "Same as we did the barn roof." Something that was almost a smile broke fully across his face, the smile she'd been watching arrive by slow degrees for weeks now, finally fully there. "Same as everything seems like lately." The first snow came 3 days later, soft and early, settling over Whitlock Ridge, in a hush that made the whole world feel new-made and quiet. Dell stood on the porch in a borrowed shawl, watching it fall, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands, and did not hear Caleb step out beside her until he was already there. "You came here with nothing," Caleb went on, "and you built this house back into something worth calling a home. Not just the kitchen. Me too. I was surviving before you came, Delilah. I wasn't living. I am now, and I don't want to go back to what it was before." He took her hand, plain and unhurried, the way he did everything that mattered. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as my cook, as my wife, if you'll have me." They stood a while in silence, the way they had learned to do so well these past weeks, the snow gathering soft and white on the porch rail, on the barn roof they'd mended together, on the whole quiet, hard-won landscape of a place that had bit by bit stopped being merely his and become something both of them had built. "I'm not a man of many words," Caleb said, finally echoing without meaning to, something he'd said once before in a different season under a different kind of pressure. "I tend to notice what's in front of me a season too late. Almost lost this place because I let my uncle make my decisions for me. I don't intend to make that mistake with you." Dell turned to look at him, her heart going quick and unguarded, in a way she had trained herself for years not to let it go. They were married a month later in the little church in Miles City. The same church where whispers had once tried to shame her, now filled instead with the 12 hands of Whitlock Ridge scrubbed clean, and standing witness with Sam Ochoa grinning wider than anyone had ever seen him grin, with Reverend Kirby presiding over a match he'd defended before he ever blessed it. Dell wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself. Caleb wore his only suit brushed clean for the occasion. "Is that a yes?" he said. And there was something almost boyish in the question, a hope he'd stopped bothering to hide. "That's a yes," Dell said, and when he drew her close, careful and certain, the falling snow settled around them both, like something the whole hard year had been building toward all along. The snow kept falling soft and steady, and Dell felt the old, careful walls she'd built around her own heart walls raised against a world that had taken from her before, and might again settle at last into something she no longer needed quite so tall. "I told myself I wouldn't trust another promise," she said quietly. But you don't make promises the way other men do, Caleb. You just do the thing quiet before anyone asks you to. Caleb laughed low and warm and drew her against his side, and they sat together in the easy quiet that had carried them from a cold depot bench all the way to this porch. This life, this small, decent, hard-won happiness, built not on a single grand moment, but on the steady accumulation of small and honest things, a basket of apples left without a word, a hand steadying, a fall on an icy ladder, a ledger opened plainly on a table, a promise kept quietly instead of spoken loudly. 5 years on the porch swing at Whitlock Ridge creaked with a familiar rhythm in the long gold light of a Montana evening, the fences strong, the herd healthy, the house behind them full of the particular warmth of a life well and honestly built. A small girl with her mother's steadfast eyes and her father's slow, careful smile chased a wooden horse across the yard, stumbled, brushed the dust from her hands with fierce concentration, and got back up without a single tear. She has your patience, Caleb said, watching her. And your stubbornness, Dell answered, smiling. Took her a full minute deciding whether to cry about it. He had been a slow man once, but he had gotten there in the end, and he had known the moment he saw her again, standing straight-backed and unbowed on that depot bench, that some things, however slowly a man comes to understand them, are worth every mile of the road it takes to arrive.
This was a story about two people who found in each other not rescue but recognition. A woman who stopped believing anyone would see her worth beyond what she could offer, and a man who stopped believing his own house could feel like home again. What they built together, they built the way most lasting things get built, slowly, honestly, one small kindness at a time. I would love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Rub your city and stay in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If the Leaf and Salef story stay with you, I would be so grateful if you hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. There's another story coming soon, and I think you're going to love where it takes you. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.